Good afternoon. When I was married, one of the respected gentlemen in our church called me for a conversation. Came to his house. He sat me down. His wife was running around trying to prepare something for tea. He looked at me and said these words, "Paul, the way you rule the house is like this," as he flexes his fist and taps it on the table. I respected listening to him for the rest of the conversation. I did not say nothing back, but at that moment, I understood that this man was not alone in thinking. To rule your wife with strength seems to be normal in how some husbands treat their wife. Thus, it begs us this question: how should a husband live with his wife? Preparing for this message, I bumped into marriage statistics that compared today's marriages to 1950s. There are currently 53% of men that are married in U.S. compared to 67% in 1950. There are 51% of women that are married today compared to 66% in 1950. Being unmarried grew 13% from 1950. Those who never married grew from 27% to 35% for men and 20% to 30% for women. And there are about 36 million people who live in U.S. alone. Think about it. There are about 36 million people who live in the United States alone. This kind of statistics is a little depressing because marriage was created to cure loneliness. God saw Adam was lonely, and he decided to make him a helper suitable for him. Genesis 2:18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be. I will make him a helper suitable for him." It is not good for man to be alone, and God saw Adam walking in the garden, concluding watching his life. Marriage is God's gift to man, so he will not be lonely. But once you get married, the question is, how do you stay married? It's not a secret that very quickly those who marry end up facing sins of their spouses and at some point regret that they have married. The words "for better or for worse," "for riches or for poor," "in sickness and in health," "to love and to cherish you till death part us apart," are no longer sweet, beautiful, and attractive. What was something beautiful, ugly. What was something heavenly became a place of hell. Fights and arguments became a reality for those who said, "I will love this person no matter what." Why? Why something beautiful turned very shortly into a nightmare? And the answer is simple: sin. Sin. It all began in Genesis 3. When a man and a woman rebelled against God in order to make their own life apart from God, in order to pursue their own dreams apart from God. Genesis 3:16, God says these words. To the woman, he said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth your children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." And that is the consequences of their rebellion. The consequences of their rebellion is destruction in marriage. Last sermon, we took time to explain what does it mean, desire for your husband. But basically, it's a desire for control. Woman desires to control her husband. And man rules his wife, dominates, dictates. It's a fist-way approach. Long before we were married or you were married, Bible predict that there will be conflict in your marriage. And the question is, can we still have loving relationship in marriage? Can there still be harmony, unity, peace? Something that was promised to be beautiful and something that was promised by God to be good. And the answer is yes. Because Jesus came and reversed the curse that was upon man and woman. Today, we will look at husband's role in a family. Last time we talked about wives' role in a family. For those who missed the sermon, you could, listen online. You could listen through our church app. But today, the word is for you husbands. Let's look at our text. Colossians 3:19. Colossians 3:19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. In chapter 3 of Colossians, verses 1 to 17, he addresses the relationship in the church. In verse 18 to 25, he addresses the relationship in the family. Verse 18 addresses the wives. Verse 19 addresses the husbands. Verse 20 addresses children. Verse 21 addresses the fathers. And verse 22 to 25 addresses slaves. Thus, when husbands are addressed, God gives this command. Husbands, love your wives. He doesn't say, husband, live with your wife. He doesn't say, husbands, be a partner to your wife. He doesn't say, husbands, submit to your wife, or even husbands, help your wife. That's not what he's saying here. No, he uses a strong action verb, love. All husband has to do is to love his wife. Simple, yet profound. This word is stated in a context or in such a way that it's to be done over and over again. This is not a one-time action. Here's the flowers, here are the roses, it's my action that I love you, turns around and goes fishing. This is a lifestyle, sorry for those who fish. This is a lifestyle for a husband till he dies. But what does that mean? What does it mean for a husband to love his wife? A husband can say, I love my wife when I discipline her. The Bible says, those who the Lord loves, he disciplines. But that's not what it says here. Someone can say, I love my wife when I submit to her. But the submission is specifically to the wives. Someone who says, I love my wife because I live with her. It's an intimate relationship that Song of Solomon describes. But when Paul writes about physical relationship between husband and a wife in 1 Corinthians 7, he describes that as a duty that both spouses have towards each other, and the word love mentions in the passage. Some husbands say, well, I take care of the bills, I give her money for clothes and food, this is how I love her. But in 1 Timothy 5:8, it says that if the husband's duty to do that, and those who don't provide for their family is worse than an unbeliever, because a non-believer does the same thing. So the question is, what does it mean for a husband to love his wife? The word love is agape, and it is used throughout the New Testament 320 times. 320 times. It is used positively and it is used negatively. In a negative context, it describes a longing, desiring, or enjoying something that is prohibited by God. Luke 11:43 describes how Pharisees love agape, the chief seats in the synagogue, and respectful greetings in the marketplace. This describes a selfish love that is built on pride. The Gospel of John 3:19 describes how light has came into the world, and men loved agape, the darkness, rather than light, for their deeds were evil. Here we have a longing to do sin, to enjoy sin, to desire sin, more than to desire God and to love God. In John 12, verse 43, the Pharisees loved agape, the approval of men, rather than the approval of God. Love described here as egocentristics built on selfishness and pride. And 1 John 2:15 states, "Do not love agape the world, nor the things of the world. If anyone loves agape the world, the love agape of the Father is not in him." And here we have two loves described. One comes from the world, one comes from the Father. So, a love that comes from the world is built on sin, pride, a Hollywood type of love. Love that comes from God is a special kind of love that you can't get from this world. How do we know how a husband needs to love his wife? Let's look at the context. This is not the first time in Colossians 3:19 he used the word love. In verse 12, he used the same word. In verse 14, he used the same word. Look, in verse 12, it describes God's love for a Christian. It says, "Been chosen of God, holy and beloved," agape. God loves us with a special love. Those who are holy, those who are chosen, are wholly separated, and they are loved by God. And in verse 14, he now commands to have the same love to everyone else. It says, "Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." A couple verses later, he addresses the role of a father or of a husband, and he zeroes in on this word. Husband's relationship to his wife is based not on strength, not on dominion, not on dictatorship. It's built on love. And the love that comes from God is given to the husband so he can express or show the same kind of love to his wife. This is the key. God isn't asking a husband that he himself has not done, that he himself that has not modeled. Husbands are to love his wife is a reflection of that love that they received from God. This is astonishing. This is mind-boggling because what it commands a husband to do, a non-believer can never do. I want to take a little bit and talk to a husband who's not a Christian. You can never love your wife the way God commands you to love, because your love to wife is going to be built on pride, selfishness, ignorance. You can never love your wife the way that you ought to or must do because you don't have that love. Unless you surrender and be loved by God first. You could do that today, right now. Confess your sin, accept the sacrifice on the cross, surrender your life to Him, fully give your life to Him, and follow Christ. That is when you can start truly loving your wife. Remember the story of an old gentleman. He's from Kazakhstan, and a little rough man, smoked, drank, had his own group of people. And poor wife, she always came, but he always came to church and sat somewhere far away. And one time, he's in his 60s. All his life, he's smoked like, you could say, whatever it is. And then he comes to church, comes to front, repents of his sin, comes to Jesus, walks outside, throws his cigarettes, never touches a cigarette again. 6 years later, he sits on the chair, rocks back and forth, and falls asleep. That's the last time he had breath. Peacefully walks to heaven. His wife's testimony on funeral is, I never was loved like this in the last 6 years. That was the best years of my life. That's a testimony of a Christian. That's a testimony of God's love. And the biggest problem of a non-believer is not your marriage. The problem of a non-believer is not that you don't bring enough money. The biggest problem of a non-believer is not that something's missing. The biggest problem is that there is no God's love in your life. What is this love that a husband needs to love his wife? I want to bring 3 aspects to this love. I don't know if I'm going to have time, but I'm sure I could push it to 2 o'clock. 3 aspects to this love. The first aspect is that we can say that love is visible. Love is visible. And I want to bring, we could use our context, but I want to take you to different verses. Look, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The question is, how did God love the world? He loved the world by sending his Son. It's a visible display. People don't have to question, does God love me? Well, it's a visible display. You open the Bible, you read the Gospels, you understand why he was on a cross. Love is visible. Ephesians 5:25 says, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. How did Christ love the church? He loved it by giving himself for her. The love of God is always on display. It is visible. It is seen. Husbands love his wife is a visible display. Oh yeah, I told her when I married, I love her. And if that changes, I'll let you know again. 1 John 3:18, little children, let us not love with words or tongue, but in deed and truth. Love of God is always on display. Love of God is always visible. Thus, the love of husband's love to his wife is visible. If a husband says, I love my wife, well, will your wife say the same thing? Will she say, my husband truly loves me? Or she will say, told him to clean the garage 2 years ago. The garage is still dirty. Husbands, come home today. Homework. And ask your wife. Ask your wife, is my love to you visible? A wife can say, I asked my husband to spend time with me, but he's tired and likes to relax and watch a show. I'll be honest. Some husbands put more effort in keeping their cars running. They're keeping their marriage thriving. Some husbands care more about what is taking place on their phone than what is taking place on the mind of their wives. Some husbands care more about fishing with their buddies than actually spending time alone with their wives on a date. And that is a display. The husbands, we need to step up. A husband love to his wife is visible love. She can see that. She is confident that she's alone in his delight. She alone is the object of his joy. She alone is the bride that sweeps him off his feet. She alone is the one who is satisfied, and nobody else is needed. God gave a husband a wife, not for her to be a housekeeper, not for her to be a cook, for her to be a back scratcher, but in an object that he loves. Some wives even think, right now sitting, does my husband even love me at all? And you, her husband, have no clue what she's thinking. Thus, love is visible. Wife knows it. The action is seen by her, by kids, by the church, by the family. Recently I asked about a person that I know, and the person who asked me says, do you know if their relationship is good? And I'm like, why? And the person's like, well, for years, this husband been posting picture of himself wherever he goes, and nowhere near is his wife. This person has a point. He is satisfied in himself, in what he does, in where he is, than actually living with his wife, who he should love. I can tell you for sure that husband doesn't love his wife. He loves himself. So love is visible. Love is visible. Second, love is sacrificial. Let's go to Ephesians 5:25. Ephesians 5:25. Paul expands this idea. Even though we could spend in Colossians 1 and 2, and we did displaying the visible love. But in Ephesians 5:22, he goes deeper. And look what it says. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. The illustration of how husbands need to love their wives is the illustration of Christ loving the church. Just as. The adverbial conjunction demonstrates how husbands must love his wife. Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, which is a sacrificial love. A model for every husband to look up to. Thus we might say, the second aspect of love is that love is sacrificial. Wives, you might think you have a hard role in your family. You might. Well, the husband is the one who needs to model Christ's love, which is almost impossible because Christ was perfect, and the husband is the one who needs to die for you. What is the sacrifice includes? The sacrifice includes humility. Philippians chapter 2 talks about. The sacrifice includes patience, giving time for a wife to turn around or for a change. The love, the sacrificial life includes kindness. The words that we speak and say, they are building her up versus tearing her down. These are the virtues of sacrifice. It is a selfless act. There's no selfishness in a husband's love for his wife. He puts his wife's interests above his interests. He elevates her to whom she needs to be before God. If there's no sacrifice, there is no love. Now, husbands, ask yourself, is this an act of selfishness? If it is not an act of love. If this is an act of selfishness that I'm trying to do, it is not an act of love. Well, some husband says, well, my wife is not perfect. I know I only have a perfect wife. Well, look what it says in 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love to us. God demonstrates his love. When? In that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Christ's demonstration of his love for you was not when you were perfect, when you were in the worst state of condition. No matter where your wife in life, your love for her is not based on her condition, where she is, how she looks. If the food is ready, God doesn't say, husbands, love your wife unless she doesn't meet your criteria. No, it doesn't say that. As a husband, you could say, well, she She does bad things to me. She puts me down. She constantly lags on me. She constantly compares me to others. She constantly refuses to listen to me. No matter what I say, she doesn't respect me. So, the Bible says, love your wife. There is no clause how not to love your wife. Second half of the verse even digs into this conversation. Look, husband, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Husband is embittered when things don't go his way, when his wife treats him badly. The word embittered refers to having a bad taste in your mouth. This word is used 3 more times in the book of Revelation, and it always have to do with a bitter taste, a bitter feeling that a person has. A sharp and bitter attitude can develop when a wife has acted sinful against him. Do not be embittered, and this is stated as a passive. It's not like he forces himself to be embittered. It's like that he been sinned against him by his wife, and the reaction to this is bitterness. Wife has already acted in such a way, and the right or the normal response to her action is bitterness. She constantly complains. She doesn't like what I do. She's unsatisfied no matter how much money I bring. She might constantly lag on me. Even the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs recognizes of a difficult wife. Proverbs 21:19. It is better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome and easily provoked woman. Life is much sweeter in a hot desert where there's no water, where there's no comfort, where there's snakes and scorpions. There are some situations that will paralyze and drive a husband crazy, which will create a bitter heart in his life. Instead of loving her, he is bitter at her. The text says, don't let bitterness sag into your heart. But what happens if the husband is bitter? He can't love her. That's the whole point. If you're bitter at your wife, you can't love her. When the person is bitter, he will speak harsh words. He will act in such a way that conflict sparks into war. He will do things that will damage the relationship with his wife, kids, family, neighbors, church, the government. Bitterness is a natural response when your wife does not respect. Don't be embittered. Don't let bitterness come into your heart. Husbands, is your relationship with your wife built on selfishness or selflessness? Is the selflessness seen in you by your wife? Do you sacrifice your time, effort, energy, money, comfort? Because love is a sacrifice. Love is a sacrifice. Now, love is visible. Love is sacrifice. And the third aspect of love is that it restores the concept of oneness. The concept of one flesh. This is why marriages exist in the first place. This is God's intended purpose for marriage. We see this principle in 5:28. It says, so husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one even hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it just as Christ also does the church. And the question that we have, what is loving yourself, has to do with loving wife. I always read that verse and was scratching, okay, is it talking about I'm selfish, now I'm just going to extend my selfishness to her? And at the first, it might look like narcissism. But it is not at all. Why does Apostle Paul tells husbands to love their wives as he loves himself. The idea here is marriage takes two people and they become one. They are oneness. If a person is married, it is not him anymore, it is them. That is why Paul connects wife to a husband's body. There is one body, physical, emotional, social. He's saying that you are not you anymore. There's both of you are one. This principle goes back to Genesis 2. Look at Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This is a principle of being one flesh. Two humans becoming one flesh. And there is physical aspect to one flesh. There is emotional aspects of one flesh. And there's a social aspect to one flesh. The love that husbands received from God restores this principle that was destroyed in Genesis 2. Being one flesh is destroyed because a husband says, I have my interest, and a wife says, I have my interest. Okay, I spent my money, you spent your money, and you live a two different lifestyle. And the whole idea of living together, you live as one. Sin destroyed the principle of one flesh by bringing selfishness, egocentric life, bringing pride. Where two people live under one roof are called husband and wife, they are strangers to each other, and the most closest relationship that exists on earth is between them is gone. That is why we have divorce. Because the principle of oneness is destroyed. The oneness is designed to be in marriage and is only achieved as husbands love his wife the way Christ loved his church. Let's look at this principle a little closely. God looks at Adam and says, Adam, you're lonely. So what does God do? God says, okay, I'll bring animals. You're lonely? Let's bring animals. Here comes the animals, one at a time. And what does Adam do? Adam looks at the animals, he analyzes them, he looks at their functions, and he gives them a name. Adam was the smartest man. Actually, he was the only man at that time. Adam analyzed them and gave them name according to who they are. After Adam named all the animals, God looked at Adam. He's still lonely. There's no one suitable to him. So God puts him to sleep. He takes Adam's ribs, fashions that rib into a woman. God brings this woman to him as he brought to him the animals. Adam looks at the Eve, he analyzes him, and something goes off. When he saw her, everything in him burst into joy and excitement. This one alone, this one at last, answers the needs of my heart, Adam says. She is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. What does Adam do? He recognizes that Eve came out of him. She is complementary to him. In contrast, when he looked at the elephant and when he looked at Eve, Eve was more excited. He was more excited for Eve. She is much more better looking than an elephant. How does Adam names her? He names her woman. And you don't really see that in our Bible, but in Hebrew, the word for man is ish, and the word for woman is isha. He added 2 letters to his name, stating that she is part of him. Unlike the animals, unlike Adam himself, because she did look totally different than him, she did not come from the ground below, but she came from his flesh. That is why God says man leaves his mother and his father and joined to his wife, and they become one flesh. The highest unity, the highest emotional relationship that someone can have is not between him and his mom or father, is because her and her husband. A man's body is not complete until God completes him with a wife. And all man can say amen. Analyzes that and gives her a name because she is like him. She completes him. That is why when Apostle Paul in Ephesians writes about this, he goes back to the origin, design, and he says, look, you have a body. You have a physical body, emotional body, spiritual body. She is you. Her interests are your interests. Her desires are your desires. Her problems are your problems. Her tears are your tears. Her joy are your joy. No matter where you are complete as one. And do you see why there's divorce? Do you see why there's divorce? This oneness is not actually oneness. They live under the one roof, totally strangers. It's only a matter of time when it blows up. God says these words in Mark 10:9. What therefore God has joined, God has joined. God interferes. This is God's action. What therefore God has joined, lo, let no man separate it, even husband or wife themselves. That's the whole idea. And I ask you, husbands, do you care about her physical aspects? Do you care about her emotional? Do you know where she is emotionally? Is there problems that you can pray for her? Do you know that she cries over her relationship with you? Maybe she weeps when you're gone and ask God to help her because she is tired of you. Do you know that, husbands? Do you care about her social life? Time alone, time with friends, time apart kids. That's a big one. We're running out of time. We could go for another hour. But let me summarize. The last is the love completes oneness, one flesh. That is only because the love that husband receives from God, he can love his imperfect wife. Thus, love has three aspects. The husband's love to his wife is visible. The husband's love to his wife is based on sacrifice. And the husband's love for his wife is built on the principle of oneness, one flesh. Marriage is supposed to be something beautiful, something delightful, something that cures the loneliness. But in these days, husbands and wives are so far away. Let no sin destroy your marriage. Husbands, love your wives. Love your wives. That is one command he expects of you.